Section 4 of Movies and Hollywood Short Story Collection, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Cliff Thompson. Mrs. Bathurst by Rudyard Kipling. From Lydon's Irenaeus, Act 3, Scene 2. Gow. Had it been your prince instead of a groom caught in this noose, there's not an astrologer of the city. Prince. Sacked! Sacked! We were a city yesterday. Gow. So be it. But I was not governor, not an astrologer, but would have sworn he'd foreseen it at the last versary of Venus, when Vulcan caught her with Mars in the house of stinking Capricorn. But since 'tis Jack of the straw that hangs, the forgetful stars had it not on their tablets. Prince. Another life? Were there any left to die? How did the poor fool come by it? Gow. Simpliciter thus. She that damned him to death knew not that she did it, nor would have died ere she had done it, for she loved him. He that hangs him does so in obedience to the Duke, and asks no more than, Where is the rope? The Duke, very exactly, he hath told us, works God's will, in which holy employ he's not to be questioned. We have then left upon this finger only Jack, whose soul now plucks the left sleeve of destiny in hell, to overtake why she clapped him up like a fly on a sunny wall. Woof! Saw! Prince. Your cloak, Ferdinand. I'll sleep now. Ferdinand. Sleep, then. He, too, loved his life? Gow. He was born of woman, but at the end threw life from him, like your prince, for a little sleep. Had I any look of a king, said he, clanking his chain, to be so baited on all sides by fortune, that I must e'en die now to live with myself one day longer? I left him railing at fortune and woman's love. Ferdinand. Ah, woman's love. Aside. Who knows not fortune, glutted on easy thrones, stealing from feasts as rare to coney catch privily in the hedgerows for a clown, with that same cruel lustful hand and eye, those nails and wedges, that one hammer and lead, and the very gerb of long-stored lightnings loosed yesterday 'gainst some king. Mrs. Bathurst. The day that I chose to visit HMS Peridot in Simon's Bay was the day that the Admiral had chosen to send her up the coast. She was just steaming out to sea as my train came in, and since the rest of the fleet were either coaling or busy at the rifle ranges 1,000 feet up the hill, I found myself stranded, lunchless, on the seafront with no hope of return to Cape Town before 5 p.m. At this crisis, I had the luck to come across my friend Inspector Hooper, Cape Government Railways, in command of an engine and a brake van chalked for repair. If you get something to eat, he said, I'll run you down to Glengariff siding till the goods come along. It's cooler there than here, you see. I got food and drink from the Greeks who sell all things at a price, and the engine trotted us a couple of miles up the line to a bay of drifted sand and a plank platform half buried in sand not 100 yards from the edge of the surf. Molded dunes, whiter than any snow, rolled far inland up a brown and purple valley of splintered rocks and dry scrub. A crowd of Malays hauled at a net beside 2 blue and green boats on the beach. A picnic party danced and shouted barefoot where a tiny river trickled across the flat, and a circle of dry hills, whose feet were set in sands of silver, locked us in against a seven-colored sea. At either horn of the bay the railway line, cut just above the high water mark, ran round a shoulder of piled rocks and disappeared. "You see, there's always a breeze here," said Hooper, opening the door as the engine left us in the siding on the sand, and the strong southeaster, buffeting under Elsie's Peak, dusted sand into our ticky beer. Presently he sat down to a file full of spiked documents. He had returned from a long trip up country, where he had been reporting on damaged rolling stock as far away as Rhodesia. The weight of the bland wind on my eyelids, the song of it under the car roof and high up among the rocks, the drift of fine grains chasing each other musically ashore, the tramp of the surf, the voices of the picnickers, the rustle of Hooper's file and the presence of the assured sun joined with the beer to cast me into magical slumber. The hills of False Bay were just dissolving into those of fairyland when I heard footsteps on the sand outside and the clink of our couplings. "Stop that!" snapped Hooper, without raising his head from his work. "It's those dirty little Malay boys, you see. They're always playing with the trucks. Don't be hard on 'em. The railway's a general refuge in Africa," I replied. "'Tis. Up country at any rate. That reminds me." He felt in his waistcoat pocket. "I've got a curiosity for you from Wankies, beyond Bulawayo. It's more of a souvenir, perhaps, than—" "The old hotel's inhabited," cried a voice. "White men from the language. Marines, to the front! Come on, Pritch, here's your Belmont. What?" The last word dragged like a rope as Mr. Pycroft ran round to the open door and stood looking up into my face. Behind him, an enormous sergeant of marines trailed a stalk of dried seaweed and dusted the sand nervously from his fingers. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "I thought the Hierophant was down the coast." "Oh, we came in last Tuesday from Tristan d'Acunha for overhaul, and we shall be in Dockyard hands for 2 months with boiler seatings." "Come and sit down." Hooper put away the file. "This is Mr. Hooper of the railway," I exclaimed, as Pycroft turned to haul up the black-moustached sergeant. "This is Sergeant Pycroft of the Agaric, an old shipmate," says he. "We were strolling on the beach." The monster blushed and nodded. He filled up one side of the van when he sat down. "And this is my friend Mr. Pycroft," I added to Hooper, already busy with the extra beer which my prophetic soul had bought from the Greeks. "Moi aussi," quoth Pycroft, and drew out beneath his coat a labelled quart bottle. "Why, it's Bass!" cried Hooper. "It was Pritchard," said Pycroft. "They can't resist him." "Well, that's not so," said Pritchard mildly. "Not verbatim, perhaps, but the look in the eye came to the same thing." "Where was it?" I demanded. "Oh, just beyond here, at Calk Bay. She was slapping a rug in a back verandah. Pritch hadn't more than brought his batteries to bear before she stepped indoors and sent it flying over the wall." Pycroft patted the warm bottle. "Oh, it was all a mistake," said Pritchard. "I shouldn't wonder if she mistook me for McLean. We're about of a size." I had heard householders of Mutzenberg, St. James, and Calk Bay complain of the difficulty of keeping beer or good servants at the seaside, and I began to see the reason. None the less, it was excellent Bass, and I too drank to the health of that large-minded maid. "It's the uniform that fetches 'em, and they fetch it," said Pycroft. "My simple navy blue is respectable, but not fascinating. Now Pritch, in his No. 1 rig, is always pure Mary on the terrace, ex officio, as you might say." "Oh, she took me for McLean, I tell you," Pritchard insisted. Why, to listen to him, you'd have think it only yesterday." "Ah, Pritch," said Pycroft, "be warned in time. If we begin telling what we know about each other, we'll be turned out of the pub, not to mention aggravated desertion on several occasions." "Never anything more than absence without leave. I defy you to prove it," said the sergeant hotly. "And if it comes to that, how about Vancouver in '87? Well, how about it? Who pulled bow in the gig going ashore? Who told Boy Niven—" "Surely you were court-martialed for that," I said. The story of Boy Niven, who lured 7 or 8 able-bodied seamen and marines into the woods of British Columbia, used to be a legend of the fleet. "Yes, we were court-martialed to rights," said Pritchard, "but we should have been tried for murder if Boy Niven hadn't been unusually tough. He told us he had an uncle who'd give us land to farm. He said he was born at the back of Vancouver Island, and all the time the beggar was a balmy Barnado orphan." "But we believed him," said Pycroft. "I did. You did. Patterson did. And who was the marine that married the coconut woman afterward? Him with the mouth." "Oh, Jones. Spit-Kit Jones." "I haven't thought of him in years," said Pritchard. "Yes, Spit-Kid believed it. And George Anstey and Moon. We were very young and very curious, but loving, trustful to a degree," said Pycroft. "Remember when he told us to walk in single file for fear of bears? Remember, Pye, when he hopped about in that bog full of ferns and sniffed and said he could smell the smoke of his uncle's farm? And all the time it was a dirty little outlying uninhabited island. We walked round it in a day and come back to our boat lying on the beach. A whole day Boy Niven kept us walking in circles looking for his uncle's farm. He said his uncle was compelled by the law of the land to give us a farm." "But don't get hot, Pritch. We believed," said Pycroft. "He's been reading books. He only did it to get a run ashore and have himself talked of. A day and a night, 8 of us, following Boy Niven round an uninhabited island in the Vancouver archipelago. Then the picket came for us, and a nice pack of idiots we looked." "What did you get for it?" Hopper asked. "Heavy thunder with continuous lightning for 2 hours. Thereafter sleet squalls, a confused sea, and cold, unfriendly weather till conclusion of cruise," said Pycroft. "It was only what we expected, but what we felt, and I assure you, Mr. Hooper, even a sailor-man has a heart to break, was being told that we able seamen and promising marines had misled Boy Niven. Yes, we poor back-of-the-landers was supposed to have misled him. He rounded on us, of course, and got off easy." "Except for what we gave him in the steering flat when we came out of the cells. Heard anything of him lately, Pye?" "Signal boatswain in the Channel Fleet, I believe, Mr. L. Niven is." "And Anstey died of fever in Benin," Pritchard mused. "So what come to Moon? Spit-Kid we know about. Moon. Now where did I last— Oh, yes, when I was in the Palladium I met Quigley at Bunraka Station. He told me Moon had run when the Astrid sloop was cruising among the South Seas 3 years back. He always showed signs of being a Mormonastic beggar. Yes, he slipped off quietly, and they hadn't had time to chase him round the islands, even if the navigating officer had been equal to the job." "Well, wasn't he?" said Hooper. "Not so. According to Quigley, the Astrid spent half of her commission romping up the beach like a she-turtle, and the other half hatching turtles' eggs on the top of numerous beaches. When she was docked at Sydney, her copper looked like Aunt Mariah's washing on the line, and her midship frames was sprung. The commander swore the dockyard had done it all in the poor thing on the slips. They do strange things at sea, Mr. Hooper." "Ah, I'm not a taxpayer, said Hooper, and opened a fresh bottle. The sergeant seemed to be one who had a difficulty in dropping subjects. "How it all come back, don't it?" he said. "Why, Moon must have had 16 years' service before he ran. It takes 'em at all ages. Look at, you know," said Pycroft. "Who?" I asked. "A service man within 18 months of his pension is the party you're thinking of," said Pritchard. "A warrant whose name begins with a V, isn't it?" "About in a way of putting it. We can't say he actually did desert," Pycroft suggested. "Oh, no," said Pritchard. "It was only permanent absence up country without leaf, that was all." "Up country?" said Hooper. "Did they circulate his description?" "What for?" said Pritchard, most impolitely. "Because deserters are like columns in the war. They don't move away from the line, you see. I've known a chap caught at Salisbury that way, trying to get to Nyassa. They tell me, but of course I don't know, that they don't ask questions on the Nyassa Lake flotilla up there. I've heard of a P&O quartermaster in full command of an armed launch there." "Do you think Click had gone up that way?" Pritchard asked. "There's no saying. He was sent up to Bloemfontein to take over some Navy ammunition left up in the fort. We know he took it over and saw it into the trucks. Then there was no more Click then or thereafter. 4 months ago it transpired, and thus the casus belli stands at present," said Pycroft. "What were his marks?" said Hooper again. "Does the railway get a reward for returning 'em then?" said Pritchard. "If I did, you suppose I'd talk about it?" Hooper retorted angrily. "You seem so very interested," said Pritchard with equal crispness. "Why is he called Click?" I asked, to tide over an uneasy little break in the conversation. The two men were staring at each other fixedly. "Because of an ammunition hoist carrying away," said Pycroft. "And it carried away 4 of his teeth on the lower port side, wasn't it, Pritch? The substitutes which he bought weren't screwed home in a manner of saying. When he talked fast, they used to lift a little on the bedplate, hence Click. They called him a superior man, which is what we'd call a long, black-haired, genteelly-speaking, half-bred beggar on the lower deck." "4 false teeth on the lower left jaw," said Hooper, his hand in his waistcoat pocket. "What tattoo marks?" "Look here," began Pritchard, half rising. "I'm sure we're very grateful to you as a gentleman for your hospitality, but perhaps we may have made an error in—" I looked at Pycroft for aid. Hooper was crimsoning rapidly. "If the fat marine now occupying the forecastle will kindly bring his status quo to an anchor yet once more, we may be able to talk like gentlemen, not to say friends," said Pycroft. "He regards you, Mr. Hooper, as an emissary of the law." "I only wish to observe that when a gentleman exhibits such a peculiar, or shall I rather say, such a bloomin' curiosity in identification marks as our friend here—" "Mr. Pritchard," I interposed, "I'll take all responsibility for Mr. Hooper." "And you'll apologise all round," said Pycroft. "You're a rude little man, Pritch." "But how was I—" he began, wavering. "I don't know, and I don't care. Apologise." The giant looked round bewildered, and took our little hands in his vast grip, one by one. "I was wrong," he said meekly as a sheep. "My suspicions was unfounded, Mr. Hooper. I apologise." "You did quite right to look out for your own end of the line," said Hooper. "I'd have done the same with a gentleman I didn't know, you see. If you don't mind, I'd like to hear a little more of your Mr. Vickery. It's safe with me, you see." "Why did Vickery run?" I began, but Pycroft's smile made me turn my question to, "Who was she?" "She kept a little hotel at Hauraki, near Auckland," said Pycroft. "By God!" roared Pritchard, slapping his hand on his leg. "Not Mrs. Bathurst?" Pycroft nodded slowly. and the sergeant called all the powers of darkness to witness his bewilderment. So far as I could get at it, Mrs. B was the lady in question. "But Click was married," cried Pritchard, "and had a 15-year-old daughter. He's shown me her photograph. Setting that aside, so to say, have you ever found these little things make much of a difference? 'Cause I haven't." "Good Lord alive and watching! Mrs. Bathurst!" Then, with another roar, "You can say what you please, Pye, but you don't make me believe it was any of her fault. She wasn't that." "If I was going to say what I please, I'd begin by calling you a silly ox, and work up to the higher pressures at leisure. I'm trying to say solely what transpired. Moreover, for once you're right. It wasn't her fault." "Well, you couldn't have made me believe it if it had been," was the answer. Such faith in a sergeant of marines interested me greatly. "Never mind that," I cried. "Tell me what she was like." "She was a widow," said Pycroft, "left so very young and never respliced. She kept a little hotel for warrants and non-comps close to Auckland, and she always wore black silk, and her neck—" "You ask what she was like," Pritchard broke in. "Let me give you an instance. I was at Auckland first in '97, at the end of the Moroccan's commission, and as I'd been promoted, I went up with the others. She used to look after us all, and she never lost by it, not a penny. 'Pay me now,' she'd say, 'or settle later. I know you won't let me suffer. Send the money from home if you like.' Why, gentlemen all, I tell you I've seen that lady take her own gold watch and chain off her neck in the bar and pass it to a bo'sun who'd come ashore without his ticker and had to catch the last boat. 'I don't know your name,' she said, 'but when you're done with it, you'll find plenty that know me on the front. Send it back by one of them. And it was worth £30 if it was worth half a crown.' The little gold watch, Pye, with the blue monogram at back. But as I was saying, in those days she kept a beer that agreed with me. Slits, it was called. One day and another I must have punished a few good bottles of it while we was in the bay, coming ashore every night or so, chaffing across the bar like, once when we was alone. 'Mrs. B,' I said, 'when next I call, I want you to remember that this is my particular, just as you're my particular.' She'd let you go that far. 'Just as you're my particular,' I said. 'Oh, thank you, Sergeant Pritchard,' she says, and puts her hands up to the curl behind her ear. Remember that way she had, Pye?" "I think so," said the sailor. "Yes, 'Thank you, Sergeant Pritchard,' she says. 'The least I can do is mark it for you in case you change your mind. There's no great demand for it in the fleet,' she said. 'But to make sure, I'll put it at the back of the shelf.' And she snipped off a piece of her hair ribbon with that old dolphin cigar cutter on the bar. Remember it, Pye? And she tied a bow round what was left, just 4 bottles. That was '97. No, '96. In '98 I was in the Resilient China Station, full commission. In 1901, mark you, I was in the Carthusian back at Auckland Bay again. Of course I went up to Miss B's with the rest of us to see how things was going. They were the same as ever. Remember that big tree on the pavement by the sidebar, Pye? I never said anything special. There was too many of us talking to her. But she saw me at once." "That wasn't difficult?" I ventured. "Ah, but wait. I was coming up to the bar when— 'Ada,' she says to her niece, 'get me Sergeant Pritchard's particular.' And, gentlemen all, I tell you, before I could shake hands with the lady, there were those 4 bottles of Slits with her hair ribbon in a bow round each of their necks, set down in front of me. And as she drew the cork, she looked at me under her eyebrows in that blindish way she had o' looking, and, 'Sergeant Pritchard,' she says, 'I do hope you haven't changed your mind about your particulars.' That's the kind of woman she was. After 5 years. I don't see her yet, somehow, said Hooper, but with sympathy. She never scrupled to feed a lame duck, or set her foot on a scorpion at any time of her life, Pritchard added valiantly. That don't help me either. My mother's like that, for one.
End of section 4.
Section number 5 of Movies and Hollywood Short Story Collection, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Candace Stellick, Dallas, Texas. Mrs. Bathurst, Part 2, by Rudyard Kipling, 1904. The giant heaved inside his uniform and rolled his eyes at the car roof, said Pycroft suddenly. How many women have you been intimate with all over the world, Pritch? Pritchard blushed plum color to the short hairs of his 17-inch neck. Hundreds, said Pycroft. So have I. How many of 'em can you remember in your own mind, setting aside the first, and perhaps the last, and one more? Few. Wonderful few. Now I tax myself, said Sergeant Pritchard, relievedly. And how many times might have you been at Auckland? 1, 2, he began. Why, I can't make it more than 3 times in 10 years, but I can remember every time that I ever saw Mrs. B. So can I. And I've only been to Auckland twice. How she stood and what she was saying and what she looked like, that's the secret. 'Tisn't beauty, so to speak, nor good talk necessarily. It's just it. Some women'll stay in a man's memory if they once walked down a street, but most of 'em you can live with a month on end, and next commission you'd be put to it to certify whether they talked in their sleep or not, as one might say. Ah, said Hooper, that's more the idea. I've known just 2 women of that nature. And it was no fault of theirs? Asked Pritchard. None whatever, I know that. And if a man gets struck with that kind of woman, Mrs. Hooper, Pritchard went on, he goes crazy, or just saves himself, was the slow answer. You've hit it, said the sergeant. You've seen and known something in the course of your life, Mr. Hooper. I'm looking at you. He set down his bottle. And how often had Vickery seen her? I asked. That's the dark and bloody mystery, Pycroft answered. I'd never come across him till I come out in the Hierophant just now, and there wasn't anyone in the ship who knew much about him. You see, he was what you call a superior man. He spoke to me once or twice about Auckland and Mrs. B. on the voyage out. I called that to mind subsequently. There must have been a good deal between 'em, to my way of thinking. Mind you, I'm only giving you my resume of it all, because all I know is second hand, so to speak, or rather, should I say more than second hand. How? Said Hooper peremptorily. You must have seen it or heard it. Yes, said Pycroft. I used to think seeing and hearing was the only regulation aids to ascertaining facts, but as we get older we get more accommodating. The cylinders work easier, I suppose. Were you in Cape Town last December when Phyllis's circus came? No, up country, said Hooper, a little nettled at the change of venue. I asked because they had a new turn of a scientific nature called Home and Friends for a Ticky. Oh, you mean the cinematograph. The pictures of prize fights and steamers. I've seen 'em up country. Biograph or cinematograph was what I was alluding to. London Bridge, with the omnibuses, a troop ship going to the war, Marines on parade in Portsmouth, and the Plymouth Express arriving at Paddington. Seen 'em all, said Hooper impatiently. We Hierophants came in just before Christmas week, and leave was easy. I think a man gets fed up with Cape Town quicker than anywhere else on the station. Why, even Durban's more like nature. We was there for Christmas, Pritchard put in. Not being a devotee of Indian Paris, as our doctor said to the Pusser, I can't exactly say. Phyllis's was good enough for musketry practice at Mozambique. I couldn't get off the first 2 or 3 nights on account of what you might call an imbroglio with our torpedo lieutenant in the submerged flat, where some pride of the West Country had sugared up a gyroscope. But I remember Vickery went ashore with our carpenter Rigdon, old Crocus we called him. As a general rule, Crocus never left his ship unless until he was ousted out with a winch. But when he went, he would return nodding like a fly gemmed with dew. We smothered him down below that night, but the things he said about Vickery as his fitting playmate for a warrant officer of his cubic capacity, before we got him quiet, was what I should call pointed. "I've been with Crocus in the Redoubtable," said the sergeant. "He's a character if there is one." Next night I went to Cape Town with Dawson and Pratt, but just at the door of the circus I came across Vickery. "Oh," he says, "you're the man I'm looking for. Come and sit next me. This way to the shillin' places." I went astern at once, protesting because ticky seats better suited my so-called finances. "Come on," says Vickery, "I'm payin'." Naturally, I abandoned Pratt and Dawson in anticipation of drinks to match the seats. "No," he says. "When this was inted, not now. Not now. As many as you please afterwards, but I want you sober for the occasion." I got his face under a lamp just then, and the appearance of it quite cured me of my thirst. Don't mistake, it didn't frighten me. It made me anxious. I can't tell you what it was like, but that was the effect which it had on me. If you want to know, it reminded me of those things in bottles, those herbalistic shops at Plymouth, preserved in spirits of wine, white and crumply things previous to birth, as you might say. "You've a bestial mind, Pye," said the sergeant, relighting his pipe. "Perhaps. We were in the front row, and Home and Friends came on early. Vickery touched me on the knee when the number went up. 'If you see anything that strikes you,' he says, 'drop me a hint.' Then he went on clicking. We saw London Bridge, and so forth and so on, and it was most interesting. I'd never seen it before. You heard a little dynamo like buzzin'. But the pictures were the real thing, alive and movin'." "I've seen 'em," said Hooper. "Of course they are taken from the very thing itself, you see." Then the Western Mail came in to Paddington on the big magic lantern sheet. First we saw the platform emptying and the porter standing by. Then the engine come in, head on, and the women in the front row jumped, she had it so straight. Then the doors opened and the passengers came out like the porters got the luggage, just like life. Only when anyone came down too far towards us that was watching, they walked right out the picture, so to speak. I was highly interested, I can tell you. So were all of us. I watched an old man with a rug, owed and dropped a book and was trying to pick it up, when quite slowly from behind 2 porters, carrying a little reticula and looking from side to side, comes out Mrs. Bathurst. There was no mistaking the walk in 100,000. She came forward, right forward. She looked out straight at us with that blindish look which Pritch alluded to. She walked on till she melted out of the picture, like a shadow jumping over a candle, and she went out, and I heard Dawson in the ticky seats behind sing out, 'Christ, there's Mrs. B.'" Hooper swallowed his spittle and leaned forward intently. Vickery touched me on the knee again. He was clicking his 4 false teeth, with his jaw down like an enteric at the last kick. "Are you sure?" says he. "Sure," I says. "Didn't you hear Dawson give tongue? Why, it's the woman herself." "I was sure before," he says, "but I brought you to make sure. Will you come again with me tomorrow?" "Willingly," I says. "It's like meeting old friends." "Yes," he says, opening his watch, "very like. It will be 24 hours less 4 minutes before I see her again. Come and have a drink," he says. "It may amuse you, but it's no sort of earthly use to me." He went out shaking his head and stumbling over people's feet as if he was drunk already. I anticipated a swift drink and a speedy return because I wanted to see the performing elephants. Instead of which, Vickery began to navigate the town at the rate of knots, looking in at a bar every 3 minutes, approximate Greenwich time. I'm not a drinking man, though there are those present, he cocked his unforgettable eye at me, who may have seen more or less imbued with the fragrant spirit. None the less, when I drink, I like to do it at anchor and not at an average speed of 18 knots on the measured mile. There's a tank, as you might say, at the back of that big hotel up the hill. What do they call it? The Motelno Reservoir, I suggested, and Hooper nodded. That was his limit adrift. He walked there, and we come down through the gardens. There was a southeaster blowing, and we finished up by the docks. Then we bore up the road to Salt River, and wherever there was a pub, Vickery put in sweatin'. He didn't look at what he drunk. He didn't look at the change. He walked and he drunk and he perspired in the rivers. I understood why old Crocus had come back in the condition he did. What do you think? Said Hooper, fingering his waistcoat pocket. Several things, said Pycroft. To tell you the truth, I aren't quite done thinking about it yet. Mad? The man was a dumb lunatic. Must have been for months, years perhaps. I know something of maniacs, as every man in the service must. I've been shipmates with a mad skipper, and a lunatic #1, but never both together, I think, Evan. I could give you the names of 3 captains now who ought to be in an asylum, but you don't find me interfering with the mentally afflicted till they begin to lay out about 'em with rammers and winch handles. Only once I crept up a little too into the wind towards Master Vickery. I wonder what she's doing in England, I says. Don't it seem to you she's looking for somebody? That was in the gardens again, with the southeaster blowing, as we were making our desperate round. She's looking for me, he says, stopping dead and under a lamp and clicking. When he wasn't drinking, in which case all his teeth clicked on the glass. He was clicking his 4 false teeth like a Marconi ticker. Yes, looking for me, he said, and he went on very softly, as you might say affectionately. But, he went on, in the future, Mr. Pycroft, I should take it kindly of you if you'd confide your remarks to the drink set before you. Otherwise, he says, with the best will in the world towards you, I may find myself guilty of murder. Do you understand? He says. Perfectly, I says. But would it at all soothe you to know that in such a case the chances of you being killed are precisely equivalent to the chances of me being outed? Why, no, he says. I'm almost afraid that you'd be a temptation. Then I said, we was right under the lamp by that arch at the end of the gardens where the trans came around. Assuming murder was done or attempted murder, I put it to you that you would still be left so badly crippled, as one might say, that your subsequent capture by the police, to whom you'd have to explain, would be largely inevitable. That's better, he says, passing his hands over his forehead. That's much better, 'cause, he says, do you know, as I am now, Pye, I'm not sure if I could explain anything much. Those were the only particular words I had with him in our walks as I remember. What walks? Said Hooper. Oh, my soul, what walks? They were chronic, said Pycroft gravely, but I didn't anticipate any danger till the circus left. Then I anticipated that, being deprived of its stimulant, he might react on me, so to say, with a hatchet. Consequently, after the final performance and the ensuing wet walk, I kept myself aloof from my superior officer on board in the execution of his duty, as you might put it. Consequently, I was interested whether the sentry informs me, while I was passing on my lawful occasions, that Click had asked to see the captain. As a general rule, warrant officers don't dissipate much of the owner's time, but Click put in an hour or more behind that door. My duties kept me within eyeshot of it. Vickery came out first, and he actually nodded at me and smiled. This knocked me out of the boat, because, having seen his face for 5 consecutive nights, I didn't anticipate any change there more of a considerin' hell, so to speak. The owner emerged later. His face didn't read off at all, so I fell back on his Cox, who'd have been 8 years with him and knew him better than boat signals. Lamson, that was the cox's name, crossed his bows once or twice at low speeds and dropped down to me visibly concerned. He shipped his court-martial face, says Lamson. Someone's going to be hung. I've never seen that look once before, but when they chucked the gun sights overboard in the Fantastic, throwing gun sights overboard, Mr. Hooper, is the equivalent of mutiny in these degenerate days. It's done to attract the notice of the authorities and the Western Morning News, generally by a stoker. Naturally, word went around the lower deck, and we had a private overhaul of our little consciences. But bearing a shirt which a second-class stoker said had walked into his bag from the Marines flat by itself, nothing vital transpired. The owner went about flying the signal for attend public execution, so to say, but there was no corpse at the yardarm. He lunched on the beach, and he returned with his regulation harbor routine face about 3 p.m. Thus, Lamson lost prestige for raising false arms. The only person who might have connected to the epicycloidal gears correctly was one Pycroft, when he was told that Mr. Vickery would go up country that same evening to take over certain naval ammunition left after the war in Bloemfontein Fort. No details was ordered to accompany Master Vickery. He was told off first person singular, as a unit, by himself. The Marine whistled penetratingly. "That's what I thought," said Pycroft. "I went ashore with him in the cutter and he asked me to walk through the station. He was clicking audibly, but otherwise seemed happyish. 'You might like to know,' he says, stopping just opposite of the Admiral's front gate, 'that Phyllis's circus will be performing at Worcester tomorrow night. So I shall see her yet once again. You've been very patient with me,' he says. 'Look here, Vickery,' I said, 'this thing's come to be just as much as I can stand. Consume your own smoke. I don't want to know any more.' 'You,' he said, 'what have you got to complain of? You've only had to watch. I'm it,' he says. 'But that's neither here nor there,' he says. 'I've one thing to say before shaking hands. Remember,' he says, 'we were just by the Admiral's garden gate. Then remember that I am not a murderer, because my lawful wife died in childbed 6 weeks after I came out. That's much at least I am clear of,' he says. 'Then what have you done that signifies?' I said. 'What's the rest of it?' 'The rest,' he says, 'is silence.' And he shook hands and went clicking into Simon's Town station." "Did he stop to see Mrs. Bathurst at Worcester?" I asked. "It's not known. He reported at Bloemfontein, saw the ammunition into trucks, and then disappeared. Went out deserted, if you care to put it so, with 18 months of his pension, and if what he said about his wife was true, he was a free man, as he stood. How do you read it off?" "Poor devil," said Hooper, "to see her that way every night. I wonder what it was. I've made my headache in that direction many a long night. But I'll swear Mrs. B had no hand in it," said the sergeant, unshaken. "No, whatever the wrong or deceit was, he did it, I'm sure of that. And I'd look at his face for 5 consecutive nights. And I'm not so fond of navigating about Cape Town with a southeaster blowing these days. I can hear those teeth click, so to say." "Ah, those teeth," said Hooper, and his hand went to his waistcoat pocket once more. "Permanent things, false teeth are. You read about 'em in all the murder trials." "What do you suppose the captain knew, or did?" I asked. "I never turned my searchlight that way," Pycroft answered unblushingly. We all reflected together and drummed on empty beer bottles as the picnic party, sunburned, wet, sandy, unpassed our door singing "The Honeysuckle and the Bee." "Pretty girl underneath that capshe," said Pycroft. "They never circulated his description?" said Pritchard. "I was asking you before these gentlemen came," said Hooper to me, "whether you knew Wankies or the way to the Zambesi, beyond Buluwayo?" "Would he pass me there, trying to get to that lake, what's its name?" said Pritchard. Hooper shook his head and went on. "There's a curious bit of line there, you see. It runs through solid teak forest, a sort of mahogany really, 72 miles without a curve. I've had a train derailed there 23 times in 40 miles. I was up there a month ago, relieving a sick inspector, you see. He told me to look out for a couple of tramps in the teak. 2? Pycroft said. I don't envy that other man if... We get heaps of tramps up there since the war. The inspector told me I'd find them at McBinwee siding waiting to go north. He'd given 'em some grub and quinine, you see. I went up on a construction train. I looked out for 'em. I saw them miles ahead along the straight waiting in the teak. One of 'em was standing up by the dead end of the siding, and the other was squatting down looking up at 'em, you see. What did you do for 'em? Said Pritchard. There wasn't much I could do, except bury 'em. There'd been a bit of a thunderstorm in the teak, you see, and they were both stone dead and as black as charcoal. That's what they really were, you see, charcoal. They fell to bits when we tried to shift 'em. The man who was standing up had the false teeth. I saw him shining against the black. Fell to bits he did, too, like a mate squatting down and watching him, both of 'em all wet in the rain. Both burned to charcoal, you see, and that's what made me ask about the marks just now. The false toother was tattooed on the arms and chest, a crown and foul anchor, with M.V. above. I've seen that, said Pycroft quickly. It was so. But if he was all charcoal-like, said Pritchard, shuddering. You know how writing shows up white on a burned letter? Well, it was like that, you see. We buried him in the teak, and I kept... But he was afraid of you two gentlemen, you see. Mr. Hooper brought his hand away from his waistcoat pocket, empty. Pritchard covered his face with his hands for a moment, like a child shutting out an ugliness. And to think of her at Hauraki, he murmured, with e'er a ribbon on my bier. Ada, she said to her niece, oh my God! On a summer afternoon, when the honeysuckle blooms, and all nature seems at rest, underneath the bower, mid the perfume of the flower, sat a maiden with the one she loves the best, sang the picnic party waiting for their train at Glengariff. Well, I don't know how you feel about it, said Pycroft, but having seen his face for 5 consecutive nights on end, I'm inclined to finish what's left of the beer and thank God he's dead. End of section 5 of Movies and Hollywood Short Story Collection, Mrs. Bathurst, Part 2, by Rudyard Kipling, 1904. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Candace Stellick, Dallas, Texas.